This podcast will discuss sensitive topics surrounding ethnicity, sexuality, and profane and blasphemous statements. The content we are creating is intended for educational purpose with no intention of causing offence. We are creating this content in a light-hearted manner as to further educate ourselves and the audience. Audience discretion is advised.
Which one of these words do you find the most offensive? Mother, maybe what if I was to call you a ooh, perhaps munch, or maybe even
See you next Tuesday, a podcast series that takes you on a journey through the profane and blasphemous language we share and the public perception that follows with it. Ep.II, Racism Rising to the Top.
Hello and welcome to Ep.II of See You Next Tuesday. My name is Isaac.
My name is Dylan. Racism. It has been an issue at the forefront of society for a long time. Racial prejudice is something that has been well documented all over the world, probably the most famous examples of racial prejudice coming from the treatment of African Americans in the United States of America.
Now, all of this racial prejudice around the world has facilitated the creation of a wide range of racial and ethnic slurs that are specifically designed to be derogatory towards a specific race. We should preface that the slurs we mention today are ones that specifically appear on the BSA study that defines the top 31 most offensive words or phrases based on tests taken on New Zealanders. So while we're sure there is a wide range of racial slurs we can investigate, we will be focusing on these ones in particular.
And if you'd like to check out that study for yourself, you can follow the link in the description below. Before we dive into the next portion of this episode, there is something definitely worth mentioning for our audio listeners, something that our viewers on our YouTube were made painfully aware of last week, and that is, well, Isaac, we're white. We're very white.
Yes, indeed we are. How white are we, you may be asking? Well, I'm so white that all of my family photos end with a silly one.
How white am I, Isaac? Well, I'm not into bird watching, but I have been known to glance at a tui from time to time and point it out to all my friends and family.
I'll do you one better, Dylan. I am so white, if I stand too close to my microwave, I get a tan.
Well, I do that awkward run, hop, skip thing if I'm not too sure if a car's going to hit me while I'm crossing the road.
Oh, that's good. Well, now that that's been covered, the N-word. The N-word is a racial slur that's been used throughout history to demean, humiliate, and degrade people from Africa. The origins of this word can be traced as far back as the year 1619, when the first documented arrival of a shipment of Africans who were sold off as slaves. These slaves were referred to using the Spanish and Portuguese words for black.
The N-word is currently number 1 on the BSA's list of most offensive language. Interestingly enough, though, the study that we are using, which is conducted every 3 or so years, the last one done in 2022, this is the first time that the N-word has been number 1 on that spot, finally overtaking the C-bomb, which is now falling in at number 2. A new slur on the list of monitored words on the 2022 list, coming in at number 2, tied with or the C-bomb, is curry. The slur, of course, is directed at people of Indian descent and stereotyped around the cuisine that they would eat.
Another word that we'll be focusing on is the word a derogatory term to use for people from China. It is currently number 4 on the BSA's list, and there are a few ideas as to where the origins of the word come from. Some sources say it's derived from the word China, and some others say that it origins from the Qing dynasty, which is a dynasty that led in China.
Another term that we're looking into, coming in at number 6 on the BSA's list of offensive words in broadcasting, is the term a derogatory term used to refer to a native of Southeast Asia or South Pacific, originally used to describe a member of an enemy military force. The earliest recorded uses of this term were by the US Marines when referring to Haitians and Filipinos. It continued to be a common slang in the American military, especially during World War II, the Korean War, and the Vietnam War.
Now, because we have to adhere to BSA standards on this podcast, these words have been censored. But if you want to know what those words are, please, we really encourage you to go check out that study, link in the description down below.
So there have been a few instances of racist slurs being used in New Zealand media and in turn being complained about to the BSA. We've taken the liberty of diving into some of the BSA case studies to see what sort of offensive things have been said in New Zealand media and, more importantly, sort of the context that sits around them, of course.
Right, I've got one for you, Dylan. This is a long one, so bear with me, but it is in regards to the use of the N-word on radio. So, this complaint came in on the 15th of September in the year 2000, so a long time ago now, but but it did still happen. So Newstalk ZB's morning talkback show on the 15th of September 2000 included an item about a press conference with boxing legend Muhammad Ali, held at the Olympic Games in Sydney the previous day. During the item, the host used the words cocky N-word when referring to Muhammad Ali at the time of his gold medal win in the Rome Olympics in 1960.
Okay, right.
So the host referred to Muhammad Ali as one of the greatest stars the world has ever known. He then went on to say, and I quote, "But when you think about it, you know, if you were around at the time and you remember that cocky N-word, because that's what he was at the time, who had a mouth that could utter things like Robin Williams can defy everybody, that you can't dislike him." Ugh.
Yeah. Okay.
So quite a few people complained to the radio network, which was broadcasting this, stating that the words cocky N-word breached the standards of good taste and decency and were derogatory and socially irresponsible.
This was in 2000.
The year 2000, so
okay.
a long time ago, but it did still happen. So in response, the radio network explained that the presenter had used the expression as part of a long and glowing soliloquy, which aimed to praise Muhammad Ali and show how, and I quote, a wide section of the global community had sometimes referred to him. This is still something that Radio Network said. The reference, therefore, to cocky N-word places Cassius Clay, which is his old name, his slave name, as it's described, in the way that he was described by many 40 years ago, stating that the piece was one of praise that also sought to show Clay as he was in the 1960s, accurately portraying him as he was often described. What are your thoughts on this so far, Dylan?
It's not looking good. It's not sounding great. I would like to think that this was 23 years ago now, that it might be viewed a little bit differently than if it was done today.
Not that it makes it okay. So the broadcaster, the radio network, acknowledged the sensitivity of the complaint and said that they had talked the complaint through with the host who said that phrase. However, it declined to uphold the complaint on the basis that in context and because it was of factual nature.
Okay.
So once the radio network didn't uphold that, the complaints were then taken to the BSA, who after a long process eventually decided to uphold the complaint for breaching Principle 1 of the Radio Code of Broadcasting Practice, which basically states don't use any offensive language. However, there was no penalty dealt to the radio network or the host of the broadcast. So essentially, all they got was a slap on the wrist for what happened.
Yeah, not a good look, not a great look at all.
No. Like, it was 23 years ago, but again, that doesn't make it okay.
No, I'd be curious to know where the N-word sort of was on a list of offensive terms back then. I still imagine it would be very, very high, which does not excuse this sort of language and behavior at all. Yeah,
so basically, because the context of what it was said was designed to be showcasing what it was like in the 1960s, that made it okay. But that... just because it was like that in the 1960s doesn't mean it was okay.
That doesn't mean it was okay at all. And you'd think that many years after the fact, you'd be like, we could recognize that was not okay now. But then still go on to be like, well, because they said it then, that's how I should be able to describe it now.
Yeah. No. Well,
Isaac, I've also got one here. It is directed at the radio network again, Richards and the radio network, and is from the year 2000 again, funnily enough.
Oh.
So radio sports host Martin Devlin referred to the Japanese as vile gits and pricks in the context of their whaling practices on a radio sport program on the 27th of September 2000 at around 8:30 in the morning.
Wait, hang on. So there was a radio sport announcer talking about Japanese whaling programs.
At 8:30 in the morning, correct.
Okay.
I don't
Probably
know.
A little bit off topic as to what you're supposed to be talking about.
Just a little bit, yeah. I mean, you can only talk about sports so much, but we continue. The host then suggested that helicopter gunships should be sent to blow up the whaling boats. And then next, a guest contributor they got on the line on the program referred to as the East Timorese militia as Mr. Richards complained to the Radio Network Limited, the broadcaster, that the remarks were offensive and racist. Yep. In his view, and the host's tone of voice made it clear that he was not joking.
Ooh, that complaint's got some grounds to stand on, I'll put it that way.
8:30 in the morning on a sports show. They don't actually preface as to what the context is, to why they were talking about this in the first place, but that's neither here nor there. I think on the whole, you can't do that. The authority was ultimately upheld.
That's good.
They upheld the complaint, and $500 was given to the Crown.
What? Hang on. Whoa. So someone on Radio Sport insulted a group of people from Asia, insulted the Japanese.
Yes.
And so because of that, $500 was paid to England.
Correct. It was a different time back there. I don't know.
I mean, that is probably the standards back then. And at the time, the Crown was very heavily involved in the kind of running of broadcasting systems. But it's kind of funny how that works.
It is a little bit ironic.
It is a little bit ironic.
You look at the solution to that and you're like, yep, fixed it.
Yeah.
No.
We also mentioned earlier in the episode that we'll be focusing on words like referring to Chinese people and curry referring to Indian people. But interestingly enough, we actually couldn't find any case studies on that, and we're not 100% sure why.
They are quite new words to the BSA's listings, so we've had a discussion amongst ourselves and we've come to the conclusion that it's probably due to the fact that these are quite new terms and there hasn't been much of an opportunity for them to be used in any context in New Zealand broadcasting so far. Yeah,
as well. And they also are really high up on that list, so we assume as well that broadcasters are actively avoiding saying those words in order to not cause offence. So that's why we can't really find any case studies on them.
So yes, while we two white males from New Zealand can talk about certain racial slurs and the context of New Zealand media until the cows come home, ultimately we are not experts.
No.
God, we never claim to be experts on the matter. But luckily for you, our listeners and viewers, we do have someone who is an expert.
Yes, indeed. We have got in touch with the BSA, whose stats we are using, and we are now joined over video by Stacy Woods, one of the chief executives at the BSA, and is going to speak to the changing trends in the offence towards racial slurs. Stacy, how are you?
Great, thanks. Nice to be here.
And it's our honour to have you on the podcast, Stacy. Our first big question. Racist terms in language have seen a massive increase in offence within media and broadcasting, with the likes of the N-word finally taking the #1 spot away from or the C word in the last 3 years. Why do you think we've seen such a shift in recent years?
It's an interesting one, isn't it? It's probably the most significant and rapid change that we've seen over the history of this research. And so we've generally seen a decline over time of your typical traditional swear words, but a real marked increase in offensiveness when it comes to words that are racially charged or slurs based on somebody's ethnicity. I put a lot of it down to changes in New Zealand's population makeup. So there are a lot more communities and a lot larger communities in New Zealand with people from different ethnic backgrounds or who've come here from other countries where it's just completely unacceptable to use that kind of language, where perhaps decades ago our population was less diverse, and so there was less recognition that those words were so offensive. I think generally, as well as the racist language, we've seen an increase in offensiveness around other words that go to people's identity. And so while words are decreasing in offensiveness where they're sort of more generic swears that don't pick on any one individual, like your fucks, it's more offensive to target people based on who they are.
Yeah. So as we've mentioned a few times, the N-word has finally claimed the top spot of the most offensive terms used in broadcasting, with more than 65% of Kiwis deeming it unacceptable in any context. However, there is a note in your study that states that the word is acceptable in more forgiving contexts or when it is used as a reclaimed word. Could you provide us with some more context for that?
Yeah, so in all of our work, context is incredibly important because the BSA's role isn't to tell people what's offensive. It's to hear from the community what is acceptable and what's not acceptable, and to apply those standards. And it's based around what people expect. So if you turn on the radio at 8 o'clock in the morning, you've got the kids in the car on the way to work, you're going to be expecting a totally different level of content to if you are watching an adults only movie at 10 o'clock at night that's about, heavy content. And so there's different standards depending on if you are speaking, for instance, on student radio, where you can get away with a lot more than if you are Kim Hill on Morning Report. And so it's not surprising at all that even for those words which are generally considered highly unacceptable, their level of acceptability will be different depending on the context. So if it's in a movie where the context is appropriate and the characters, it makes sense for them to be using that language, even the N-word, people will be a lot more tolerant of it than if it's just thrown about in a current affairs program, for instance.
Okay, so context does play a very big role in sort of the uses in broadcasting and media.
Yeah.
So why do you think the N-word is deemed more offensive as other derogatory terms for other races? They aren't ranked quite as high as the N-word. So you're able to provide a little bit more understanding as to why that might be?
Yeah, and look, I'm not a historical scholar, but it does, I think, have a lot to do with the historical context of that word, and probably a bit to do as well with the dominance of American culture in TV and radio. But the historical use, the background, how that word has been used over time, gives it more power as an insult. And it might be different in different cultures. If you were to go to a non-Western culture, then other racially charged words may be more offensive. But in our culture, where we do have communities who would be particularly targeted by that word, we do have a real familiarity with American history and culture. It's not surprising that is and has remained at the top of the list.
Okay, so the history that a word stands on has such a massive impact on how offensive it is deemed by the public. Hey, thank you so much, Stacy, for joining us. We really appreciate what you had to say in regards to your study.
So Stacy will be joining us in all future episodes going forward, discussing the BSA's thoughts on their findings around different areas of offence that we'll be discussing. So we've had a look at the big picture in terms of racism and terms used in New Zealand media and broadcasting, but we're going to go and move to something a bit more homegrown. The next section of our in-depth look, and it pains me to say this because it's still a prevalent issue in 2023, and that is, Isaac, unfortunately, the use of the Māori language, or Maori, as some will still say, and there is a clear distinction that is worth mentioning, because not only is there a vast selection of complaints against its use being used at all, there is also a list of complaints around words and phrases, quite commonly place names in New Zealand, being mispronounced.
It is well worth mentioning that the BSA, as of 2021, has taken a stance that they will no longer be looking into complaints about the use of Te Reo Māori. In their own words, the authority does not consider the use of Te Reo Māori, which is an official language of New Zealand, in broadcast raises any issues of broadcasting standards and will decline to determine such complaints. Its use is a matter of editorial discretion. Broadcasters are not expected to respond formally to complaints about Te Reo Māori.
Personally, I think this is a great move, very important for the identity of the country. New Zealand, of course, being the only place in the world that you'll hear the Māori language. Yeah. Before the BSA put out their blanket statement in regards to the language in 2021, there is a long list of people writing in to complain about the use of the Māori language. I have a case study here in front of me, Vorwerk and Discovery New Zealand Limited, which is, of course, the owners of TV3. And of course, it's going to be directed at the news or News Hub Live on at 6 p.m. It doesn't even say specifically what he wanted to complain about, but it was just the use of the Māori language across the broadcast. It doesn't even give any specifics. So naturally, it was just thrown out. It's important that the news, well, in my opinion, it's important that the news use Māori as often as possible. It is one of our official languages, and it's one of the best ways to get it more common in its usage across the population. So
yeah, 100%.
So naturally, this one was thrown out, and they sort of just didn't want to comment on it, which is fair.
Yeah, interesting. So the case that I have is actually slightly different. So this one is against NZME, New Zealand Media and Entertainment Radio. And it's kind of the flip side of what your one was about. So in this one, the host used Te Reo Māori, but they butchered the pronunciation completely. The complainant complained to NZME Radio about the mispronunciation of the Waikato town Matamata on Newstalk ZB. So the complainant's complaint was on the grounds that Māori are a recognised section of the community as identified through whakapapa or te tiriti o Waitangi. The Māori language has been bastardised in a way that is prejudicial to Māori. Also, by mispronouncing Matamata, the hosts are encouraging discrimination. And finally, radio stations have influence over listeners by way of consistency. This consistent mispronunciation over the radio station creates discrimination in the community because Matamata is used in everyday conversation rather than the correct pronunciation of Matamata. So NZME has claimed that it's been working with its radio hosts to help with correct pronunciation of Te Reo Māori words. However, the complainant has claimed that he's been sending NZME regular emails regarding the incorrect pronunciation of Māori words for more than 2 years and has seen little to no improvement. So the broadcaster responds, so NZME claimed that they did not believe that any perceived mispronunciation of a Te Reo place name without any malice present can be acquainted with encouraging discrimination or denigration within the terms of any broadcasting standard. So they declined it, and it was then transferred on to the BSA, who also were unable to determine an outcome, so they declined to determine an outcome on the specific case study. They stated that as a regulator, they were well aware of the importance of proper pronunciation and use of Te Reo Māori as an official New Zealand language. However, unintentional mispronunciation of Te Reo is not specifically captured in any of the standards. So they didn't uphold the complaint. However, they did encourage NZME to train their hosts on the proper pronunciation of Te Reo Māori words.
So there's definitely a conversation to be had around the use of the Māori language in New Zealand and how familiar we are with its use in New Zealand media and broadcasting. And we are joined by our next guest, who is the perfect person to be able to speak to this.
Yes, our next guest is a prominent Māori figure in the broadcasting industry, is a Newstalk ZB announcer alongside Simon Barnett. This is James Daniels. James, how are you doing today?
Kia ora, kei te pai.
James, it's an absolute honour to have you on the podcast with us. So you started your broadcasting career in the 80s. How accepted was the Māori language within broadcasting at that point in time, and how has that acceptance changed over your time in the industry?
Of course, in those days, hardly anyone pronounced Māori words properly, including me, embarrassingly, because my mother was a teacher of Te Reo, and we heard it in the home when I was growing up in Christchurch, but it wasn't heard mainstream, wasn't heard really anywhere. So I used to say rangiora and waimakariri, and one day we had a phone caller came through. We used to take a lot of calls live to air, and this voice comes in and says, "Son," and I go, "Oh, Mum," and she goes, "You keep saying rangiora, you know it's not rangiora, it's rangiora." And I go, "Mum, go away, leave me alone." And it was funny, but it was also embarrassing. And then it's even more embarrassing when I think about the fact that, you know, I had the opportunity to say it correctly because I knew that that's how you said it, but no one else said it that way. And so I was just complying with the majority. But that doesn't mean that it's right, the pronunciation. And nowadays, people are pronouncing Māori words and place names and people's names much more correctly than they used to. So that's been a big shift over 40 odd years.
Well, it's great to see there's been a shift over your time in the industry, and it's great to see that your mum was holding you accountable while you were in your early stages of your career. So recently the BSA has announced that they are no longer accepting complaints relating to the use of Te Reo Māori. Despite this, have you personally received any backlash for your use of Te Reo?
One of the first we get hundreds of texts an hour, close to 1,000 texts an hour. One of the first texts we got on my first day was, "Why don't you say hello? Speak English or I'm leaving." And I didn't even think about the fact that I must have said kia ora. And I saw red. I replied to them and said, "Haere atu rā," goodbye. And so there was a lot of pushback initially. Yeah, you still get those sorts of messages, but that's kind of due to Newstalk ZB's core audience, which is, a bit older and not as diverse as a lot of radio stations, but hey, it's a huge audience, so you know you got to cater to them, and you got to play your cards wisely. So I think I'm in a privileged position to be able to do that kind of thing. But yeah, I'm not on a crusade with the reo, but it's just common use of a language.
It's interesting that you say that your Newstalk ZB audience is slightly older, because one recurring thing that we found when we're going through the BSA's case studies is there are still a large number of slightly older New Zealanders still finding the term Pakeha sort of offensive. What are your thoughts on the large number of New Zealanders that still find the term Pakeha offensive?
Well, I don't think it's a word that denigrates. Pakeha is not a word that would denigrate. You can take it that way, but, well, like any word, and I mean any word, it depends on how you're using it. The C word that you guys are familiar with, that I'm familiar with, I can use that as a positive thing. It can be a compliment to someone, you know, a good person. And then the word Pakeha, if you spit it out, it's probably to be taken as an offence, offensively, but it's just a descriptor, I think. And the thing is that I'm Pakeha as well through my great-great-grandfather, James Robinson Clough, which is where I get the name James from. And one of my other great-great-grandfathers was a Frenchman named John Morel. So, you know, I'm part Pakeha, or I'm Pakeha as well as Māori. And I don't see what the big drama is about it. And once again, it comes back to how you use a word as much as how you define a word. You know, we need to chill a bit. And I don't mean get cold.
So from what you're saying, context is everything in these situations. Context is so important.
Context is everything. You know, the words are a component of that, but it's the context and also the power that you put into those words. And that can be through context, and it can be through the way that you say it.
That's an excellent point. And just one last thing before we let you go, James, because I understand you're a busy man. Is there anything else that you would want to say in regards to the shift in acceptance of the Māori language being used in New Zealand media, broadcasting, or even just society as a whole?
I've been in this industry or this business, this sector for 46 years. I've seen some massive changes, and they've been both technological and societal. And one of the things is that, as I said before, there was very little te reo Māori spoken. And I'm not here to sort of beat the drum on that. It's just that was a matter of fact. And growing up in Christchurch in the 60s and 70s, I mean, you look at my school photos and I'm the only brown face at Central New Brighton School, Shirley Boys High, you know, and in the late 60s, early 70s. And so I was assimilated into the society of the time. Now, 50 odd years later, my mokopuna are in a much different society. Most of them live up in Auckland now, but some of them, their first language is te reo Māori. So, you know, it's not the ogre. It's nothing to be worried about. It's a beautiful part of this country. The funny thing is that when you go overseas, and if you want to find out if there are any New Zealanders in a crowd or a bar, all you have to do is "Tutira mai ngā iwi." Oh, where, you know. And when New Zealanders get together overseas, what do? A haka, you know. So, I mean, it's giving me goosebumps thinking about it. It's part of us. It's a beautiful thing that no other country has. So can we shut the hell up about it and just get on with it? And as I say, my moko are living a different life to me, who was too embarrassed to say rangi ora.
Wow, that's some really powerful stuff, James. Thank you for being so open with us. Hey, we really appreciate what you had to say, and we really appreciate that you took the time to join us on our podcast. We really are so happy to have someone of your prowess joining us as well. So thank you so much for that. That is it for the second episode of our podcast. Once again, a massive thank you to Stacy and James for sharing their thoughts and opinions on racial and ethnic slurs used in broadcasting. If you have anything you would like to say in regards to anything we have discussed, please reach out to us on our Instagram at seeyounexttuesday.pod or email us at seeyounexttuesdaycrew@gmail.com. Links to our socials will be in the description down below.
We've learned a lot about the use of racism in New Zealand broadcasting and media over the last couple of weeks, and in the investigative look into this podcast, we've learned a lot of things. There is one thing that we know for certain, and that is we are and we will see you next Tuesday.